Robert Hughes, firebrand art critic. Clive James, memoirist, broadcaster, poet. Barry Humphries, savage satirist. Germaine Greer, feminist, libertarian. Exiles from Australia, all of them.
I did believe in the great Australian ugliness.
There was somewhere else outside of Australia. The action was abroad, and especially in Britain. And you choose Britain because Britain was easy to get to.
She came on dressed as a nun, and she did a striptease.
Had he walked into the room, 3 nuns might actually have dropped their vows.
I was a band writer.
Part of you might have enjoyed that.
Most of me enjoyed it.
Because they actually left, they've sometimes been regarded as traitors.
And what a duller place, and what a thinner place this country and, in a sense, parts of the English-speaking world would have been if those 4 hadn't landed on these shores and made for London and got it by the throat, which is what they did.
They were 4 prodigiously gifted writers, critics and entertainers from Australia, a place they considered a sleepy backwater. They dared to take on the world, London and New York, and they succeeded spectacularly. My name's Howard Jacobson, and I feel that my life, strangely, has been intertwined with theirs for the last 50 years. Late in 1964, I sailed to Australia to take up a lectureship at Sydney University. I spent the next few years enchanted by the beauty of Sydney, while they tried their luck in the Britain I'd been glad to leave. We pick up their story in 1970s London, where their brilliance is about to burst upon the British. England was no longer the deferential, class-bound country they had found when they got here. Change was in the air, and they, though they never considered themselves a group, saw their opportunity in it. In 1972, Clive James landed the job of TV critic at The Observer. "Call no man happy," he wrote later, "if he has never been ordered to go home and watch television."
I was wasting my time with a PhD that was never going to be written, but I was publishing stuff all over the place in Cambridge and also in London. Because one of the editors, at least one, the literary editor of the New Statesman, invited me to write pieces for him. And I did, and they started to catch on. And then I wrote for the Listener. These magazines were very powerful at the time. Everybody read them. Everybody you wanted to reach read them. And then television criticism for The Observer. So by 1972, I was on my way.
And when Clive got hold of a television column in those days, it's what you did when you retired. It's what you did when you couldn't really write columns. He got hold of a television column and turned it into something that everybody had to read. He made it his power base in terms of literary London. Nobody had done that before.
This ability of yours to move across from popular culture to serious culture, your at-homeness in both. It's kind of mad to say that's Australian, but it's not English. That carelessness of the distinctions, that principled carelessness of the distinctions, isn't English.
Popular culture was my observation point. I had a natural affinity to it, and nothing was more natural to me in the world than to say what I thought. It was a big advantage to come from a country where saying what you think is something you do all the time. Sometimes people bristle when they hear it.
Clive's form of engagement was, witty penetration based on serious reading. So he wants, to sort of get everybody high on words and thoughts and ideas and things that are cleverly confounding at the same time.
On the South Bank show, Melvyn Bragg was extracting, drop by drop, a fascinating interview from Harold Pinter.
Start there.
Yes.
It was exactly like getting blood out of a stone, except that stones do not smoke. Pinter smoked all the time. In the tight headshots, there was so much smoke pouring up from the bottom of the screen, you began wondering if his trousers were on fire.
So how did you set about it?
He says that humorless people, it's not just a little disability that affects them, means they don't laugh at jokes. He said people without a sense of humor shouldn't be trusted with anything. You know, don't even give them a letter to post. He said people without a sense of humor have no common sense either, because that's all a sense of humor is common sense dancing. Now that's
Common sense dancing.
Dancing.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, and
That's fantastic.
And sort of things become clear. It's very, you know, sort of luminous remark there. And his criticism is full of things like that.
If a sense of humour is common sense dancing, then the book that made Germaine famous was Rage Cavorting. Part feminist tract, part literary criticism, The Female Eunuch was also a dismantling of that Australian masculinist code known as mateship. Only an Australian woman hardened by the encounter could have drawn on such reserves of scorn.
Everybody now knows that there's something called women's liberation. A lot of people think they know what it is, and they don't. But a great many more people think that they perhaps better find out.
Germaine came in, there'd been a lot of people writing about feminism and tiptoe, this is the way it should be. Gosh, we've got things wrong. And she came in and went, The Female Eunuch. It was one of the books you roared through. It really was an important book, and still is. Historically, but at that time, it was important for the present.
She was a kid when she wrote this book. I mean, she was a kid. She wasn't 30, was 30? It's just unbelievable.
33 she must be, 32 when it came out.
Unbelievable. She was talking about the way the patriarchy was duplicated even in the Black Power movement, which, you know, was nothing you can't say that, but she did. And, you know, you sat back and you thought, yeah, how come all the guys are actually out there with the bullhorns who were in the back rooms with the mimeograph machines, you know? But she said it.
I'm sick of the powder room. I'm sick of pretending that some fatuous male self-important pronouncements are the objects of my undivided attention. I'm sick of going to films and plays when someone else wants to, and sick of having no opinions of my own about either. I'm sick of being a transvestite. I refuse to be a female impersonator. I am a woman, not a castrate. Well, you can hear 18th century satire in The Female Eunuch. It's one of the joys of The Female Eunuch. I think you can.
Oh, yippee!
The swell.
Yippee!
The swell of it. It's a very English literature book, I've always thought. The
Yes,
Female
but it's
Eunuch.
badly written, I'm afraid.
Well, not to my ear, but...
I write better now. You'd want to, wouldn't you, after 50 years of trying?
Have you read Germaine Greer's book, The Female Eunuch?
No.
You want to read it?
No. Yes, I wouldn't mind reading it.
Oh, I think so. But what's it about?
I mean, all I have to sort of go on is what people tell me about reactions that I don't have a chance to see. You know, like someone saying that her cleaning lady has been talking about it, or somebody saying that the barmaid in the pub were talking about the issue. Because after all, they are interested in the issue. They are women, and the issues touch them.
And my mum tells me interesting stories because she read the book when she was when it first came out in 1970. She got it from the library. And she says that it totally changed her life. She was a teacher, but she hadn't realised how repressed she was. It changed her views on everything, on motherhood, on the workplace, on friendships, on the division of housework.
I'm often struck when I meet you at a party at the number of people waiting their turn to thank you for, you know, changing their life. The number of women thank you for changing my life, thank you for changing my mother's life. It's not going to be very long before they're going to thank you for changing their grandmother's lives. That was a huge book.
But do you listen to my answers?
Well, it's implied.
Because I always say the same thing.
What do you say?
I always say, I didn't change your life. You changed your life. And if I was any help in that process, I am grateful and touched. But I didn't change your life. The thing about The Female Eunuch was not the book, which I don't think is a terribly good book. It was the moment.
That sense that you've done something so big that's made such a difference that everybody is talking about.
I don't have that sense. I really don't have it.
You didn't at the time?
And that's partly my libertarian background, because that teaches me, the way it would have taught any Marxian historian, that books don't change events. Events create books.
That's me on this month's poll.
Whatever event created The Female Eunuch, Germaine knew how to ride the crest of it. The world's most photogenic polemicist, modelling feminism and frocks. Were you a fan of The Female Eunuch?
Wasn't my line, really, The Female Eunuch. It served its purpose. It was a good title.
Dame Edna would have been an avid reader of it.
Dame Edna claims to have inspired it, because Dame Edna had a small school in her house. It's called The Dead, which means Dame Edna Academy of Drama. And various people, Mr. and Mrs. Crowe brought little Russell along, Mr. and Mrs. Blanchett brought Tiny Kate, Mr. and Mrs. Minogue. They all went there, and Mr. and Mrs. Greer even brought their difficult daughter. And Edna gave her a few hints about how to... I mean, she watched the way Edna treated Norm, and I think she got a few feminist ideas from Edna.
Barry was on a slower boil, acting in Oliver, getting drunk, forgetting which theatre he was appearing in, and writing his Barry Mackenzie comic strip for Private Eye. But in 1972, he tasted success with his film of a naive Aussie led astray by unscrupulous, degenerate Poms.
Strike me, Pink. Hey, aren't we at Earl's Court yet? This has taken longer than the plane trip. Nearly there, Gov. Stupid bummy bastard.
I suggested to Barry that it would be good to make a film from his comic strip of Barry Mackenzie, you know, the gormless Australian adrift in London. Because the comic strip, well, I thought, screamingly funny.
Come on. This wouldn't put me wrong, would you? No. Wait. All right. Oh. It's terrific. Come on, beautiful. I don't know. You sure? Get it Come down. I've been poisoned. Warm as piss. Oh, God, stop mucking around. Get the thing.
Now, Barry, at the time, when we made Mackenzie, was not having a good time at all. Alcoholism was consuming him. He was more often to be found lying in the gutter somewhere or being, you know, beaten up in back lanes. So Bruce Beresford and I saw the Humphries film, saw Barry Mackenzie, as a method of getting Barry on the straight and narrow. And it did. It helped Barry, you know, focus his energies, and he worked brilliantly. Also, he worked cheap. He played almost 3/4 of the characters in the film, which saved us an immense amount of money on actors.
Listen, mate, I need to splash the boots. You know, strain the potatoes. Water the horses.
I think he wants to go to the loo.
Well, of course he made a fool of Australia, but that's not a bad thing to do. All of us need to be made fools of, and Barry did it brilliantly.
I was also talking about British society as I saw it at the time, and especially the trendy 60s, the swinging London, a moral quicksand in which this poor Australian, innocent, was sinking fast.
So how was Bob Hughes surviving these moral quicksands?
Heaven or hell, what does it matter to the depths of the unknown to find something new?
Outwardly prospering as psychedelic lecturer and art pundit, he was living beyond his means, here in Chelsea, in a disintegrating marriage, consoling himself with booze and drugs and literature.
But a single phone call is all it takes to change a life. And the phone rang suddenly for Hughes.
Bob was leading a very harem-scarum sort of freelance life. He was in debt, and the bailiffs were after him, and he was also I would say more than his fair share of controlled substances was flowing through that cerebral cortex at that point. The then managing editor of Time read a book called Heaven and Hell in Western Art by Robert Hughes. And he said to himself, why can't Time have art writing like this? And Bob was spooked by the thought that somebody who hadn't identified himself very clearly was seeking him from the United States. And so he concluded that he was being stalked by the CIA. He finally did get on the phone, and it turned out that it was indeed Time magazine seeking him, and he was interested.
When I joined Time, all my friends in London, like Richard Neville and co, sort of looked at me and said, well, that's enough of you, Bob. You've joined the establishment now. And then, reflecting upon this, I flew to New York and walked into the Time office and went up to see the managing editor's secretary, who sort of looked at me cursorily and said, yes, you're the new house hippie.
They needed to escape to flourish, but paradoxically, what flourished were the very things that made them Australian. Barry's high wire scabrousness, Germaine's louche puritanism, Clive's voracious mastery of every medium, big and small, Bob's erudite thuggery. What are these but expressions of Australian genius?
You know, Bob was a brave, colorful, sort of magnificent man, and carried himself with real swagger. When he was the art critic at Time, when everybody else at Time Inc. was very corporate, they wore a certain type of tie, a certain type of suit. Bob wore, you know, black leather motorcycle outfits. He'd ride into the office on his Triumph. So Bob was he just went counter to everything and made it work for him.
He always called me Bobby, which was fine. I liked being called Bobby. And I usually called him Robert, trying to assign to him the dignity that he required. So this was kind of his introduction to the United States. And then he didn't know anybody. And I introduced him to everybody. At that time, I was writing for both Vogue and New York Magazine. And then, of course, he was writing for Time. I think it's that Chris Christopherson song, The Silver-Tongued Devil. He's a walking contradiction, partly truth and partly fiction.
This is Soho, New York. Run down and dangerous when Bob Hughes moved here in 1970, not yet the epicenter of the fashionable art world. But he had an eye for a grander canvas. He knew that in Superman's New York, the art critic could be a hero. Hello, John.
Hey, Alan.
How are you? Good to see you. Fenelli's.
We're here at Fenelli.
It's here. Great bar.
It's pretty amazing.
And one of his favorites?
Yeah, it was one of his favorite hangouts early on, especially because most of the artists that we knew about in American art at that time lived right around this bar.
So if they drank, they'd have had a drink here at one point.
And many of them drank here.
Because you always imagine that the art critic is aloof from the world of the artists themselves, doesn't want to meet the actual artists. One thing to talk about art, but who wants to meet them? Because you might get a punch in the face. You must have feared that.
Well, I think that he had no fear of that. And I think he also kind of relished the idea that he was sitting here with a glass of whiskey in amongst them. Here I am. I said all I have to say about you. What do you have to say?
If the cliché of modern sculpture used to be a piece of stone chewing gum with a hole in it, then the cliché of video art is a grainy close-up of some UCLA graduate rubbing a cockroach to pulp on his left nipple for 16 minutes.
But in American culture, whether you're talking about politics or you're talking about art, you obey certain kind of rules of decorum. And that's why, you know, when Bob didn't in some of the timepieces, it had this kind of fantastic force of detonation. Bob was a good hater. He was a good rager. He was a good ranter. But the things that he hated and raged against and ranted about were important and noble causes. When I became art critic of the New Yorker, he gave me some good advice. He said, always remember the art world is the enemy of art. Actually.
You know, Bob used to get up very early in the morning and blaze away. In those days, at the typewriter and later at the computer. And then he would have lunch and take a nap. And these naps became notorious around the time corridors. Other writers would make jokes about the fact that, oh, well, I suppose Bob is snoozing now. It's his nap time. And once in a while, I had to bring them up short by saying, listen, before you even come to work in the morning, Bob has written more words than you're going to write all week, and better words at that. So, you know, don't make fun of his naps. They're well-earned.
Did you like his art criticism?
Yes, I did. I mean, I read it with the greatest pleasure now. You know. He's very good about a lot of artists who really, long before we knew much about them, you know. I mean, he was there on the spot in New York where it was all happening.
Though Germaine Greer didn't roar in on a motorbike, after the international success of The Female Eunuch, she too was ready to storm New York.
When the American press started coming to talk to me, one of the women from Vanity Fair or something said to me, "You do realize, do you, that your life will never be the same again?" And I said, "Oh, I don't want my life not to be the same again. I like my life. I like teaching, being involved in the underground. I like working with Oz. I don't want to be famous," is what I could have said. But I didn't really know what a bore being famous is.
Germaine Greer did have a real voice. First of all, you know, it's the birth of feminism in the United States. And she obviously is a strong person. I mean, actually, of the four of them, the person whose work I've read is Germaine Greer. And I think everybody read it. If I had to choose between Germaine Greer and Gloria Steinem, give me Germaine Greer. I mean, she was a serious person, not a narcissist. She wasn't selling herself.
Such was the notoriety of The Female Eunuch that Norman Mailer, the great male heavyweight writer of the time, squared up against its author in a much publicised debate in New York's Town Hall.
A documentary captured it. Town Bloody Hall, it was called, Germaine's phrase. It was more a love-in than a debate. The novelist smitten, the young feminist flattered. Positively Shakespearean it was. Antony and Juliet.
Well, Norman Mailer had made many statements that were anti-feminist, and the feminists absolutely hated him. So why not put him on the panel with the great Germaine Greer? Who else could answer him, we thought?
The young and formidable lady writer, Miss Germaine Greer from England.
Germaine Greer, at that time, there was a beauty and a glow about her. And an attitude.
That I'm having to confront one of the most powerful figures in my own imagination. The being, I think, most privileged in male elitist society, namely the masculine artist, the pinnacle of the masculine elite.
And she was so brilliant. And she came out with these remarks. Why do you think the whole event was called Town Bloody Hall?
Use the mic, Norman.
It's obviously a cheat.
Because I think it's too serious to do it just so I can defend myself against hecklers in the Town Bloody Hall.
I mean, it was a bit scary, the whole thing.
You offered to have admired him and offered to have been sort of slaying the father in a way in your fight with Mailer. Did you admire him?
Of course I admired him. But I loved him too because quite early on, Dick Fontaine, who made the film about the raising of the Pentagon with Mailer, Dick Fontaine had said to him, Germaine's, you have to understand, Germaine's actually quite vulnerable. And Mailer said, of course she's vulnerable. She's a writer. I thought, Norman Mailer called me a writer. I'm a writer. Wow. Ooh. Norman Mailer calls you a writer. Guess what? You're a writer. Damn.
But it wasn't just for being a writer that Germaine appeared on the covers of magazines, the price for fame being condescension.
Her refusal to lead with that kind of female compassionate. I understand, especially when we talk about Germaine being surrounded by these giant male intellects, all of whom had a fierce and overconfident masculinity. But I thank God for the courage of the uncompromising female.
Yes, I'm afraid the ladies were a bit wilted, so I
Now,
thought there's...
look at these, look at the unusual colours. Have you got colour, viewers?
Germaine wasn't the only Australian beauty exciting crowds wherever she went.
They match my ocelot outfit rather, don't they?
By the mid-70s, Edna Everage, once a plain Australian housewife, now a superstar, had been made a dame by the Australian Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam.
Hello, darling.
Hello, David. The joy of working with comedians, I found, love working with comedians. The trick's always been to back off it and understand the rhythm that they work at. And I love doing that with Barry, because, you know, again, it was the eyes. I could see he'd look at me when he needed me, and I could see this, and just put something just to shift him that way or that way. It's fascinating working with them. It's the first time I've seen your legs.
Well, I have very, very nice legs, though I say it myself, ladies. And I'm not a bit ashamed to show them off, and I think I'm very lucky at my age to have them.
That's true, yes, in any shape or form.
And I have to thank Michael Parkinson for really giving me a good thrust forward in the early 70s. And I still think he was a great interviewer because he could, not unlike yourself, he could submerge his own personality. And he could take a step aside, you see. He didn't see himself as the star of the interview. There's a lesson here somewhere.
Barry Mackenzie, who used to chunder all over the place and fall down legless wherever he could. There's Celeste, who we're going to meet in a moment, who no doubt will be sozzled. And you yourself are a teetotaler, aren't you?
Yes, I am. I'm totally a teetotaler. But I was, in fact, such a boozer that I was offered a senior job at the BBC, and that shows you...
Was he different to interview in Australia? Was he
No.
different?
No, I didn't find that at all. Celeste might have been a little bit more vulgar in Australia, although that's difficult to imagine.
I'm passionate about Celeste, and a lot of people don't get Celeste.
Well, women don't like Celeste, you see. Men generally get Celeste. Have you ever seen the false dong hanging down? Well, he was sitting next to an actress called Jackie Weaver, an Australian actress, very bonny actress who had a comeback recently. And he shook her by the hand and he put the hand on the...
Is that a new suit? It's a brand new...
Are you one of these women that doesn't go for Les Patterson?
Oh, no, I adore Les Patterson. Les Patterson is such a parody of all those men I grew up with, those media moguls and those sexist oafs. And that sexism is still innate in the language. You know, if you think about in the workplace in Australia, if a man is seen to be good at work, he's called assertive and a go-getter and, you know, boss material. A woman with the same sort of drive is seen as a bitch and a ball breaker. More blatant in Australia. At least you can see the enemy. I mean, the battle lines are drawn and you can see the enemy. I find the sexism in Britain, for example, much more insidious and sort of hidden away.
He's a very good friend of mine, and I never got into it. This is a misconception.
It all seems to me to be a complete
The 70s had seen our four Australians coruscating on the page, but there was a bigger audience waiting to be dazzled. By the 80s, you had only to turn on your television to see them.
One of the things we're told women really like is oral sex. Oh. Do they get enough of that? Well, look! Did you see his face? Need I say more?
Celeste Patterson.
You see, backs and bikers have this unfortunate image in the United States.
Here's Billy Connolly. He's Stephen Fry. Michael Palin.
Good evening and welcome to a brand new series of the talk show that puts conversation on television. And why shouldn't it? Look at the way television gets into conversation.
How, when everything was going so well in the literary sense, did I decide that a television career was possible too? And the answer is I followed my nose. I got asked, and I couldn't resist it, because that little characteristic that had been there from the beginning, since I was 2 years old in my memory, made itself manifest. I'm a performer, and I was asked to perform. And also, of course, it paid the bills.
Well, we didn't like each other to start with. He was writing television criticism for The Observer. Russell Harty and I were endeavouring to do talk shows. And he wrote a piece once where he said of both Russell and myself, why don't they do something useful like going and invading Russia? And I took umbrage with this. I thought it was a rather nasty thing to say. So when he took my job over on my job I'd done before, I did a talk show, Cinema, Granada, which he did very badly because he actually didn't understand then how to write for television. He wrote his column and then tried to read it. Well, it didn't work. So I wrote to him and said, we're nearing Moscow, would you like to join us? And from that point on...
Revenge is sweet, yes.
From that point on, we became friends.
I was persuaded, if I didn't already think so myself, that entertainment was the sharp edge of television. That if I really wanted to be of value, that's what I should do. And since I could do it, I did it.
After the initial shock, I was glad to see that nudity was still a feature of Berlin beach life, and I resolved to try it myself next time. Perhaps at night.
They had something like 17 million viewers or something when he was at its height.
Yeah, and people be talking about it for the next few days. And say, do you see Clive Jones the other night? Absolute classic. You know, you'd hear that a dozen times a day after one of those shows.
So you didn't feel that your telly career interfered with the other ambitions that you had to be a serious
Yes, I did. And I knew that it would, because television is very demanding. Especially if you write your own stuff. You're going to be in the office for 5-6 days a week for every hour you get on air. And I was for 20 years.
As you must have known, you'd have to beat back the idea that you're a well-known television personality. You do popular things. You reach ordinary people. You can't be expected to be taken seriously as a literary figure.
I'm still fighting it. For example, I write a serious book, say my latest book of poems. These books might suffer the fate that a serious editor will give them to an unserious reviewer.
I don't think any culture is negligible, except possibly that of New Jersey.
James once warned Hughes that if he did too much TV, nobody who mattered would take him seriously. I'm glad, Hughes wrote later, that I ignored his advice, and happier still that he did.
Hughes's first great television series was The Shock of the New. People said he'd knocked the title off from somebody else. The series itself was all his, and the most shocking and the most new thing about it was Hughes himself.
And I don't think we are ever again obliged to look at a plywood box or a row of bricks on the floor or a videotape of some twit from the University of Central Paranoia sticking pins in himself and think, this is the real thing.
I grew up, you know, when was Shock of the New, 1980, I think it was. You know, I was a student then, and it was, you know, we were riveted to it every week. We watched The Shock of the New, and we had his sort of lyrical, aggressive, erudite, you know, clear explanation of the history of modernism, really.
We went to Houston once, to the Rothko Chapel in Houston, filmed there, and it was incredibly serene and quiet. And there were these huge, great paintings on the wall, these great sort of dark mauve. And we all thought they were just dark paintings. But actually, when you listen to what he talked about, they just came alive. And it just you suddenly saw that they worked in that place.
The world has drained out of them. Now, does that make them religious art? Holier men than I have thought so in this chapel. And if I have my doubts, it's because they're so very withdrawn. The horizons and storms of earlier romantic sublimities have gone, and what is left as the sole subject of contemplation is a void.
There was no superiority. There was absolutely, he was one of us. I suppose that's what you find about Australians. You know, there's no pretensions. There's nobody saying, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you, you're not important enough. We never had any of that feeling with Bob. And he was, of course, always late with his scripts. You know, he was always saying, oh, yeah, I posted those last week. And, you know, he hadn't written them at all, you know. So he was forever writing things at the last minute. And that's why they were so brilliant, because he had a deadline, you know, and he was doing these things. So he'd be sitting in his room, tipping away minutes before we were filming.
It was hugely influential, you know, at the end of it, I mean, I quoted him in one of my Reef lectures. I say, the avant-garde is now a period style. And he said that in 1980, you know, and that was very close to the end of modernism, really, in many ways, you know, to call that shot then.
Yes, he pronounced more or less the end of modernism.
In some ways, I mean, you know, now it's sort of, you know, there's a lot of art commentators will agree that sort of modernism fizzled out sort of mid-60s, probably mid-70s, something like that. So to call that shot in 1980, you know, that's a nanosecond in cultural history terms.
Dame Edna was to endure longer than modernism. By the 1980s, she had outgrown Mooney Ponds. The world was now her playground. It wasn't so much that she mixed with royalty as that royalty mixed with her. I'm curious at what point you felt that Edna began to escape you. Novelists always talk about the fact that there's the moment you know it's working when the characters are determining what happens and you're not. And there is a moment, isn't there, or maybe there were stages in which Edna stops being a satire on a suburban housewife and becomes something altogether. She starts to fulfill another function.
Yes.
When did she escape you in that way?
It starts to be about fame, you know, and celebrity. The character of Edna or Sandy, or even Les Patterson, they do really seem to have a life outside of me. I can't always decide what's going to happen to them.
She's gorgeous, Zsa Zsa Gabor!
What she became was what Barry once described brilliantly to me. He said, Dame Edna looks like a bird of paradise. In reality, she's a vulture. And I think that's exactly the right description of it.
And I think that Barry uses Dame Edna as license to do things perhaps that he might not do when he's himself a man in a dress. So it's a license for mischief.
I did. Is she going to be all right? No, she was wearing a natural fur, and I'm sorry, I'm a consolation.
And as for Dame Edna, she's just become impossible. She's now so bizarre and far-flung that she has nothing to do with Mooney Ponds anymore. But when she first appeared on the scene, she was Melbourne.
You preferred her before she became Dame Edna superstar.
Oh, of course.
Myself, I think this misses the genius of Dame Edna's evolution from a mere satiric portrait of a suburban housewife into a figure of orgiastic comedy, unrestrained and terrifying, a supreme affirmation of unfettered life. At the height of their careers, our brilliant creatures turned their thoughts to the Australia they'd left. The other side of the exhilaration of leaving home is a longing to go back.
They have done great things, not least, it seems to me, because they have done them far from home, a long way from any comfortable, consoling sense of belonging.
Let me try and put my finger on the nostalgia for Australia. The big challenge that Australia offers is you're there, you're living in a country that's quite hard to improve on. If you're in a lucky part of it, you're faced with an incredible amount of beauty.
In an Australian suburb at the age of 18, I played the music of Delius and Vaughan Williams on the gramophone and dreamt of England. Now, so often in reluctant exile, I hear Summer Night on the River. And it is Melbourne's Yarra I picture in my mind's eye.
You have to answer the question, is if I can't be happy here, where can I be happy? And the answer is no, nobody can be that happy.
I don't think I could have come from anywhere else. I really don't. I think my impudence is Australian. My insensitivity is Australian. My lack of respect for social nuance and position is Australian.
The place they once couldn't wait to leave was taking its revenge on their imaginations. Clive's first memoir was published in 1980 to the warmest of receptions. For all its hilarity, it is shot through with a sort of anticipation of melancholy, giving readers all they normally have to go to several books to find.
The Americans call it a breakout book, and that, in Britain anyway, was my breakout book. Unreliable Memoirs did unexpectedly well. Television didn't get in the road of that. I wrote that one as if I was breathing the air. It was just seemed the natural thing to do. It didn't occur to me not to do it. And it was only later on that I realized I'd hit a lucky streak, that I was writing something I should write more of.
Unreliable Memoirs is the funniest book, besides your books, that I have ever read. I mean, it is, you have to, don't you think?
Yes, I do.
It's just a perfect
Yes, I
little
do.
comic masterpiece. It's a joy. You could never tire of reading it.
The last couple of sentences I actually had in my brain since Sydney University. They were there for 20 years. And then I wrote the book that went in front of them.
What is the last sentence?
It's about the light on the bridge calling us home.
Pulsing like a beacon through the days and nights, the birthplace of the fortunate sends out its invisible waves of recollection. It always has, and it always will, until even the last of us come home.
But that book was written like a poem. I had all kinds of phrases lying around for years. It's not written like a novel.
It was always very funny about Australia, and of course, Unreliable Memoirs and all that. That we were on holiday. I was staying with him in Biarritz, where he'd rented a place. And we were walking along one evening. He said, it's just like Australia here, he said, except that a giant blood-sucking spider hasn't just attached itself to your leg. He's very funny about how red in tooth and claw Australia is.
Germaine Greer wrote her own take on her childhood and family, Daddy, We Hardly Knew You. It was a very different work from Unreliable Memoirs, more touching than you'd expect, but also, as you'd expect, not funny.
I remember my first meeting with my father. I was 6 years old, and my mother and I went to Spencer Street Station, and we walked along the station looking at all these army greatcoats, and they all passed and met other people, and we kept on looking and looking until there was one man left. And my mother walked up with her head on one side and said, Reg? And this old man said, Peg. And that was my father. And I thought, oh, because there was this wonderful photograph of this laughing cavalier on the mantelpiece, and I got this old man instead.
It's a very interesting book, and one of the things you say
I think
in
it's
that...
my best book, actually, by miles. Daddy, We Hardly Knew You.
Yes, I like it very much indeed, and I like the sort of relentless pursuit of him. It's like a thriller, actually, tracking him down and tracking him down.
My generation grew up fatherless, at least till we were 6 or 7. In the case of Clive, he grew up fatherless altogether. And our relationships with our fathers were never quite right. And one of the reasons why we're the way we are is because we lacked that paternal element.
She's right. She's put her finger right on it. It's the lack of an emotional outlet. In my own books, it's just a glaring absence. I mean, the absence of my father and what my mother was faced with in bringing me up after the war is just the key subject. But it's not the central subject, because I really can't think of a way of treating it.
In The Fatal Shore, Bob Hughes found a way of treating fathers, forefathers anyway. This epic of Australia's colonisation burned with the rage of the disinherited.
He speaks of the color of the waves and the feel of the wind, the smells of the... And somehow he encapsulates all that different stuff in one moment where you actually you're thrust back in history and you feel like, my God, I'm on this boat with these mortal, suffering fools.
It had an enormous effect on me. It was one of a couple of books that made complete sense of my country and the total cruelty of its founding, and which was so continually, richly, beautifully written. And I thought it was a work of genius and a book for the ages, a book for us for the ages.
To write The Fatal Shore, to hold Australia, to look at our history, not through the view of, you know, a romanticism of colonisation, but the brutal, bloody reality, is a painful and shocking thing to do. And it's unsurprising that we don't celebrate Robert to the degree that we should, because he's made us uncomfortable.
In fact, Australians found it hard to forgive any of them for having kicked their heels clear of the country years before.
They were there. We were here. They weren't, in fact, central to what was happening here. They'd taken their energies overseas, leaving some of us here to try and, well, overcome the cultural cringe by organising a cultural binge. Visits from any of them were like royal tours.
Years went by when we all got it in the neck from resident Australian critics.
It's all smoke and mirrors. Surprise, surprise.
Germaine, do you sometimes just sit in England and think, I've got something crazy to say, I'll jump on a flight to Australia?
I think the truth was that although we might not have carried the flag highest, we'd carried it furthest. We were part of Australia's image. On the whole, we made Australia look like what it is.
Well, we don't like people who go away. We don't like people who act grand.
But it was a mightier hand than Australian public opinion that cut Hughes down.
Police say there was a head-on collision more than 100 kilometres south of Broome.
In 1999, while on a fishing trip in northwest Australia, Robert Hughes nearly died in a head-on collision. Bloodier than Banquo, he wrote later, Shakespearean to the last.
He said several things about that 4 hours when he thought he was going to die, because he thought the car was going to catch on fire and he was going to be burned. He begged Danny O'Sullivan, our guide who was there, to shoot him if the car caught on fire, because he was so hopelessly pinned inside of it that he knew if the car ignited that he would be burned, and he just couldn't. And of course, Danny just kept comforting him and saying, "Don't worry, Bob, everything's all right." That kind of, you can imagine this god-awful scene. And the only people there were a number of Aborigines who had circled the car and were singing, doing some ancient ritual. And I think that so profoundly affected him. He didn't know how to deal with that. He understood Catholicism. He understood the art and history of ancient Egypt or whatever, but I don't think he had a grasp on Aboriginal chanting that would keep someone alive.
Very interesting seeing a crippled Clive. Right.
It's alleged Mr. Hughes...
Physically, Hughes never fully recovered, but the subsequent publicity took its toll on him as well. The press accused him of elitism, a necessary quality in an art critic. But really, it was the silver spoon he'd been born with that they couldn't forgive.
You did an interview in New York where at one point you said, tow Australia out to sea and dump it for all I care. Do you still struggle with a sense of bitterness about this?
I don't. What I said was, as far as I'm, after stuff I've had from the Australian media, you can tow Australia out to sea and sink it for all I care. Well, that's not actually the way that I feel about Australia.
He loved Australia. He told me, you know, in Sydney Harbour, you know, manhole covers with quotes, names of writers. It's called Writer's Walk. And Bob went to see his. And it was of such huge importance to him. And he felt so happy, deeply happy about it. He was our Dante. He did take us on a guide into our hell, the hell of the beginning of the country. And it would have been really nice for before, in his last years, for people to have had that more in mind than their desire to slaughter him.
They woke us up, made us laugh, made us think, made us question, made us see Australia differently, and made England a richer place too. And now, for themselves, what? Is there a last frolic in them?
I've set up this charity called Friends of Gondwana Rainforest because Gondwana Rainforest is the most threatened in the world. It's subtropical rainforest.
This is a very different voice one hears now from the voice of the female eunuch.
Oh, yes. And so it should be.
Because you're older and you've been on the earth longer? Or because, do you regret anything about the you of the female eunuch?
No,
or was
no.
that a necessary thing to
No. Women are all change, as you know. We change and change and change. We have 7 climacterics in our lives, and I'm in the last one, well advanced in the last one. And in the last climacteric, you're the sleepless people, you're the guardians, you're the watchers on the housetop, and that's what you do.
Dame Edna, is she now truly about to hang up a frock?
Well, I personally am sick of trailing her around and touring.
Tonight, as the show wears on and on, that I will glance up there from time to time. I will. In strict proportion to the amount that you have paid.
I'm calling it a day, but I think I'm presenting a very good show now. It's tried and tested in my homeland of Australia. And I can always say in England, world premiere in Milton Keynes after a provincial tryout in Melbourne, Australia.
Too cruel.
Or the other way around.
But you're going to miss her.
Oh, I think she might be doing the odd television spot.
And Clive has crowned a career of astonishing versatility with a translation of one of the greatest of all epic poems.
Your translation of Dante is the no end to the man's ambitions.
I thought maybe I've learned enough about poetry in 50 years of writing it, 60 years, that I can bring this off, a verse translation of the verse masterpiece. So I set out to do it, and it took years.
Tuta trembla, what's that wonderful line about...
Tutto tremante, trembling.
Yes.
The lovers kiss each other, tutto tremante. Really, I'm clearing my desk and resigning myself to the fact that I can't do anything big. The idea of writing the perfect poem still attracts me.
A perfect poem. Wow. This is Lavender Bay on Sydney's North Shore. I came to live here in 1965 when I first arrived. I had a little flat over there, from the balcony of which I watched the Opera House go up. What I looked out on was beauty. And beauty, like boredom, is highly conducive to the making and the appreciation of art.
Robert Hughes died in 2012. He called me mate once. You treasure something like that. But these films have been a sort of requiem for all of them. Clive, very ill, writing exquisite poems of remorse. Barry, indulging Dame Edna, one final demonic act of comic cruelty. And Germaine, concentrating her energies on one small Garden of Eden instead of the great battlefield of ideas she once audaciously commanded. Can I ask you where you would want to be buried?
Would I want to be buried? I might want to be eaten.
Where would you want to be eaten?
Wherever it happens, wherever I'm felled. And you know, like I broke my leg in the forest one day, and I realised that if I hadn't been able to get back up the stairs, one of my goannas would have eaten me. Bones, hair, teeth, eyes, spectacles and all.
Germaine talks about being eaten by goannas. I can't see you fancying that.
No, I don't. The goannas I know would not tackle a task like that. Outside my parents' house, the grassy verge was called the nature strip, an American term, I think. And I think there what might be nice, if there was enough room for people to leave bouquets of flowers, you know.
There could be a fight over this in Australia, actually, of course. Various people, Mooney Ponds might want.
Yes. There might be a state funeral, perhaps.
No, strangely enough, I'm not afraid. And to die in your own time, having lived a full and rewarding life, is a great privilege. It's just bad manners to complain.
I've chosen the music.
Delius?
Bit of Delius, little bit of Cole Porter, a song by Leonard Bernstein from On the Town called Some Other Time. Do you know the song? There's a calculator to make people cry, you see.
I'm crying already.
So it'll be a nice event, and I think I may stay alive for it. At the end of my present show, which is advertised as a farewell show, and is, I say to the audience, thanks for coming, and promise to come to my next farewell show.
They called Australia a culturally stagnant country, but don't they prove that you can come from a roughhouse and be the more civilised for it? Australia taught them to mistrust Kant,
It's convulsively funny.
to question authority,
It means the battle is beginning.
to nose out self-righteousness, and to imagine on an epic scale. And was it not for these qualities that we have admired and loved them?
Ladies and gentlemen, Clive James.
I was down by Bondi Pier, drinking tubes of ice-cold beer, with a bucket full of prawns upon me knee. But when I swallowed the last prawn, I had a technicolor yawn, and I chundered in the old Pacific Sea. The song is entirely about vomiting. I don't think there was much in that genre at that time.